Hi there, good afternoon. Welcome to Brazier. Some fast-paced news for you from 4 until 6 today. Coming up this hour, we've got all the latest from Ukraine. Plus, will the health and social care levy introduced today actually make it harder to keep on putting up taxes so that the NHS budget can get bigger and bigger year after year? Also, the nightmare faced by a small Gloucestershire village. What started as a row over parking ended in a fatal knife attack by a man known as the neighbour from hell. We ask, what can be done to stop antisocial behaviour from becoming murderous? And 5 years ago, women's campaigners successfully lobbied for the novelist Jane Austen to be put on the £10 note. Is she really now being replaced by an American as part of a plan to decolonise an English literature curriculum? Alongside me throughout today's show, the commentator Emma Webbe. But first, the latest news headlines from Simon.
Thanks, Colin. It's just gone 4 o'clock. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister says the 1.25% rise in national insurance is unquestionably right for our country and the NHS. The increase means Britain's tax burden has now risen to its highest point in 70 years, impacting the income of millions of households. The government predicts £39 billion will be raised over the next 3 years. Boris Johnson says it will help reduce the NHS waiting lists.
Most important thing is to have a strong, robust economy in which you have a high level of security in your employment, in which people know that there's a long-term plan to deliver jobs and growth.
Meanwhile, the Chancellor's popularity with voters has declined as the cost of living continues to soar. A YouGov survey found Rishi Sunak's net favourability has dropped 24 points in the last fortnight since he made the spring statement. Earlier, campaigners dressed up as the Chancellor outside the Treasury office in London, protesting the rise in national insurance. Vladimir Putin's daughters are among those being sanctioned by the US over Russia's alleged war crimes in Ukraine. In a new round of sanctions announced this afternoon, the US says it's targeting Russian financial institutions as well as Kremlin officials and their family members. The Russian president's 2 adult daughters are the latest to be named. Boris Johnson says what's happening in Bucha and other revelations from Ukraine doesn't look far short of genocide. Ukrainian officials say at least 410 bodies have been discovered in Bucha and other towns around Kyiv. Speaking ahead of a NATO meeting of foreign ministers, Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says he believes war crimes have been committed.
We have all seen the atrocities that have been committed in Bucha and other places in Ukraine. This reveals the true nature of President Putin's war. Any targeting and killing of civilians is a war crime, and therefore NATO allies are supporting the international efforts to establish all the facts, to investigate and to make sure that perpetrators are punished.
Jens Stoltenberg there. Earlier, the Ukrainian president spoke to the Irish parliament and called for more sanctions. Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia is using hunger as a weapon and deliberately creating a food crisis.
I'd like to ask you to convince EU partners to introduce even more rigid sanctions against Russia that would really make sure that the Russian war machine will stop. The only thing is that we're lacking is the principal approach of some leaders, political leaders, business leaders, who still think that war and war crimes is not something as horrific as financial losses.
The governor of Ukraine's Luhansk region says buildings are on fire in the area after Russian shelling. He's urged residents to get out of the eastern region over concerns that Russian troops are preparing for a new offensive in the Donbass area, which includes Luhansk. In the encircled city of Mariupol, the latest British intelligence reveals heavy fighting and continued Russian airstrikes. Most of 160,000 remaining residents in the city have no light, communication, medicine, heat or water as Russian forces have blocked humanitarian access. The Prime Minister says biological males should not compete in women's sports. Speaking during a visit to a hospital, Boris Johnson said to him it seems sensible. It's after he defended the government's decision not to include trans people in the proposed ban on conversion therapy. He added there were complexities and sensitivities which needed to be worked through. And married couples in England and Wales are now able to legally break up without having to attribute blame for the breakdown of their marriage. In the biggest overhaul of the law in half a century, no-fault divorce legislation comes into force today. Campaigners say that for families who want to break up amicably, it will help families move forward without conflict. Ed Sheeran has called for the end of baseless claims against songwriters. It's after today, where he won a High Court battle in the copyright case of his single Shape of You. Ed Sheeran has insisted he's always tried to be completely fair in crediting people who contribute to his albums. Posting on social media after the verdict, the singer said claims like this are too common and are damaging to the songwriting industry.
Only so many notes and very few chords used in pop music. Coincidence is bound to happen. Hopefully we can all get back to writing songs rather than having to prove that we can write them.
This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens now. It's back to Brazier.
6 minutes past 4, lots coming up today. We start with this. From today, millions of Brits are going to be paying more tax as national insurance payments rise by £1.25p in the pound, if that makes sense. No, 1.25p in the pound, you know what I mean, and you'll feel it soon. The government argues that the health and social care levy is necessary to help clear NHS backlogs post-pandemic and prop up social care. However, critics warn that the levy is a tax too far, with the cost of living rising sharply, as we keep reporting here and you keep reminding us in your emails. It's beginning to hurt. But might it also do something which hasn't happened before, at least not within living memory, creating a way of showing the tax-paying public just how much public money goes to the NHS. I'll explain why that might be in a second. First, let's turn to Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research, and that is Vicky Price. Vicky Price, welcome to you. I mentioned just at the end there, as part of my explanation, that this might, I'm going to introduce that word that this part of the jargon, you're familiar with it, perhaps our viewers and listeners rather less so, hypothecation. Nobody's saying this is a hypothecated tax, but it will appear on people's pay slips, that the figure that goes to this health and social care levy. And it introduces this idea that if the government wants to substantially increase NHS spending, that figure will need to rise, and people will see a linkage, perhaps for the first time, between what's disappearing from their pay packets and what goes to the NHS.
Well, it's a good point, but of course the NHS receives an awful lot more than what this extra payment is going to be collecting, except of course we've been paying national insurance contributions until now, which have been used possibly for all sorts of government spending reasons and not necessarily all going to the NHS. But there are other bits of at various times of the tax take that go to the NHS as well. So there has never been a real differentiation for people to know exactly how much of everything that's collected actually goes to the NHS and they feel they can contribute. We have figures out every year, but we don't see it in our bills. So if you start seeing that, that's obviously a positive development. But bearing in mind that that is only for the increase. And remember, a lot of the reason for changing the name of whatever extra it is that we'll be paying, rather than it just being national insurance contributions, is that much of it is supposed to go to help the underdog, which is basically social care. But in reality, over the next 3 years, the majority of what we're going to be paying is what the NHS needs anyway in order to cope with an aging population, the extra queues, of course, of people, on waiting lists, waiting to be seen by doctors because of the COVID disruptions. And very little will go to social care for some time to come. And I think it would be really interesting if in the future we could also see on our bills the proportion that goes to the underfunded social care.
The phrase you use there, Vicky Price, for some time to come. What we don't know is how long, do we? Or indeed, if ever.
Well, indeed, I think the population ageing is a pressure on the National Health Service, which has been there for quite some time. Clearing the backlog of all those cases will take years, probably. and needs are increasing constantly. And the truth is that for some time, in real terms, the NHS wasn't receiving the money that it needed. That was during the austerity period. Now, the money that's coming is making up for those losses. But of course, a lot was gone astray, if you like, for a number of years. So there is a lot of catching up to do. And remember, of course, that we're having an inflation problem. We should be paying our nurses and care workers a lot more than we have been doing so far, and their pay is semi-frozen at present still. So costs are going up and will be going up more generally, which suggests to me that indeed there will be more to pay in years to come. But the population may be quite happy with that if they can see that this money is really going in the right direction. But we have to make up for a lot of what wasn't spent in the right way over the last few years, and that's going to cost us a lot over the foreseeable future, I'm afraid, to compensate for.
Vicky Price, for now, thanks very much indeed. Appreciate your time. Webbe is alongside me to reflect on the final component of that Vicky Price was introducing, that this is part of a collection of price increases. It's not just, obviously, the health and social care levy, but in terms of what's going into your shopping basket, what's going into your fuel tank at the petrol forecourt, it's across the board.
And the cost of electricity as well. And I think we are really heading towards economic disaster for everyday people. As individuals, we'll be experiencing this, as you say, being able to actually see on your paycheck where that money is going and being spent on what is essentially an ever-expanding black hole that we call the NHS. I think it's no surprise that the Chancellor's popularity is going to be declining amongst the population, because this really is going to hurt people. And I think many people will be asking themselves, particularly Conservative voters, whether this big state, high tax party that we voted for really is Conservative at all. I think they're suffering an identity crisis, and I think that the decisions that they're making economically are really going to be unpopular with the country, particularly by raising national insurance at a time when people can't afford to pay their bills. And
just on the point that I laboured a little bit there, but I think it's an important one, that people actually see, to some degree, where the extra tax take is going. I think George Osborne tried something like this a while ago, or at least it was an attempt to sort of show on your pay packet, or at least once a year, how your tax take is being disposed of on your behalf by the state. As Vicky Price says, just said a moment ago, what you pay towards the National Health Service isn't reflected on your pay slip. But in future, any increases that the state wants to give to the NHS might be. But of course, it's in the gift of the Chancellor. If a future Labour Chancellor comes along and says, actually, let's just roll it all into general taxation, they'll be none the wiser. And that'll be how it is.
I think even in the short term, it introduces a sort of transparency that is going to, I hope, lead people to look at the NHS and think that maybe this is something that isn't sustainable and does need reforming, because there are many other health services around Europe. We often compare ourselves to the United States, but that is the absolute most extreme antithetical example that we could come up with. All across Europe, all across the developed world, there are health services that are free at the point of access. And I think we need to be looking at the way that other health services work and whether we can do things in a more cost-effective way, because at the moment it's clear that this, as I say, ever-expanding black hole is not sustainable. And if people can see that they are just having their money endlessly thrown into this well and it's gobbling up their finances and their savings and their paychecks, I think that will really force people to look at the reality in the face and see past what has really become a sacred cow.
And I know this is a very minor point, but it's one I obsess about, I think, a little bit. But the language around this, I observe, tell me if I'm wrong, but it feels to me increasingly, I hear people talk about government money. And actually, the government doesn't have any money. It's your money, it's my money, it's your money. It's not government money, it's taxpayers' money.
It's a sneaky little word trick, and very often you do hear people talking about government money when actually we should be referring to it as taxpayer money. And this is why organisations like the Taxpayers Alliance have been so good in highlighting the way that our tax money is spent very, very badly and wastefully, not just on a government level, but also on the level of local authorities. I think we need to reassess the way that we approach a lot of these things, and we're going to have to, because, as I say, this is really hurting people's pockets. People are living in many parts of the country now, living in fuel poverty, are having to make decisions between whether they heat their house or whether they feed their children. And I think that that's something that the Conservative government are going to have to address, and raising national insurance at a time like this is not going to be popular.
OK, we're going to move abroad. We might come back to this a little later on, certainly we'll in the next time. But for now, we'll park it and talk about what's been happening, or at least one of the things has been happening in Ukraine. And a Russian colonel has been linked to apparent war crimes in the Ukrainian suburb of Bucha. The name of the officer, Lieutenant Colonel Azatbeg Omabekov, and those grisly images of what appear to be civilian massacres seemingly carried out by Russian forces in Bucha before they withdrew have, I think it's reasonable to assert, stirred a global outcry in recent days. Perhaps you saw the pictures of Volodymyr Zelensky when he visited the scene there, looking absolutely harrowed and on the point of tears when he saw what had been left behind there. Those images, they've prompted Western nations to expel dozens of Moscow's diplomats and propose further sanctions, including a ban on coal imports from Russia. Well, here in the studio to discuss this, the security expert and regular contributor here, Will Geddes. Will, thanks for coming in, appreciate it. Just before we get into the politics and the strategising, those images from Bucha, I had a contributor in yesterday who said, well, she hinted at the fact they may not be real. And, you know, I think Chip Chapman, who was sitting where you were, and I said, look, actually, there is a time when you have to say there is objective truth that we need to declare. You know, this was a massacre of civilians in Bucha, and you can't get into acting as an apologist for a murderous regime that's capable of doing this.
No, exactly, and I've seen an awful lot of material, specifically of some of the atrocities that are being committed down there. Inevitably, there is going to be hearsay, there are going to be false reports, there is going to be propaganda, and we have to bear in mind that there will be a skewed message that will get out. And again, it's down to the reliability of the sources. However, we have now had this corroborated by various independent, impartial agencies, not only news agencies, but independents as well, that are able to corroborate some of the horrific activities that are going on down there, but also a lot of the other intelligence which is coming to light about filtration camps. And you and I think, were discussing this a couple of weeks ago about how POWs would be treated and whether they would be treated with the requirements of the Geneva Convention. And I think it's quite clear that that's not happening.
But that's stupid. That's militarily stupid, isn't it? You do not want your enemy to fight to the death for fear of knowing that if they don't fight to the death, they'll be executed if they surrender.
Absolutely, but also in the same respect, Colin, there has also been information and intelligence surrounding the summary execution of any man under the age of 50, so civilian or otherwise. So there are so many different reports coming out that regardless of those that are civilians taking up arms, obviously in the fight to defend Ukraine, or whether they be individuals that are simply inert non-combatants, what we're seeing is unfortunately more and more reports. I don't think it is a wholesale campaign to carry out these atrocities. Certainly the involvement of groups like Wagner, the groups like Chechens, will mean that they are brought in for shock and awe, and that kind of shock and awe will be to create terror within local
and do you think that would be it? Do you think that's actually an instrument of warfare, that actually they want to terrorise the local population?
Yeah, because, you know, they want to take those that are almost sort of in the middle ground. As you know, I've been operating in a capacity down there, or certainly some teams that I'm connected to are. They know that there are a lot of young men who feel that they can't leave because between the ages of 18 and 60, they are required to stay in country. They are not automatically or forcefully conscripted, but they're not allowed to leave the country. What we're seeing now is a lot of non-combatants who are going, we've got to just get out. And this is the shock and awe tactics, is fundamentally to destabilise that kind of propaganda that Ukrainians are pushing amongst each other in terms of we're winning the fight, to undermine that. But this is more than just PR. This is the actual implementation of horrific tactics and human rights abuse.
Emma Webbe is my studio guest on today's show. Emma, did you think those pictures from Bucha marked a significant punctuation mark in the story of Ukraine's suffering?
I think so. I think that many people around the world, particularly world leaders, will have looked at those images and thought we have to be tougher on this, even if it hurts our pockets, even if it hurts our people financially, economically, that we have to step up and be serious about these sanctions. And you would hope that it would have that effect. I think it's outrageous that there are people who are denying that these images, as you say, that have been independently verified, and I would want to know why they are denying that this has taken place, because you know, Russia has been known to commit atrocities in other countries as well. This is nothing new, and these are war crimes, and I think that this has marked a real turning point in the way that people are perceiving Russia. And also, from a strategic point of view, in a way, Putin has burnt the bridge behind him, because it's very difficult to imagine world leaders sitting around a table and negotiating with a man who's essentially committed genocide.
And all the while, we'll get us. There are Western leaders who are saying this isn't just an opportunity to condemn Putin and his cronies. This is an opportunity to actually do something concrete. So we've got the Czechs saying, actually, here's some tanks. Here's some heavy armour that you can use in your fight.
I think what is also becoming more transparent, and again, time will tell, is there is actually a disconnect between Putin and his military commanders, where it's believed that him and his military commanders were very much in sync as to his exact requirements. Putin, you can accuse him of many, many things, but he is not politically suicidal. For him to have condoned these kind of atrocities on the ground would be insanity, and I can't actually believe that he would sanction that. So it is more of a question of disconnect. It's probably trying to please their boss, for lack of better words. They are trying to expedite their progress. The ways that they're feeling that they can do that is by taking these shortcuts of torturing, murdering, and abducting individuals, obviously in Ukraine, to try and undermine, obviously, the morale of the troops and everything else. But I think this is where the UN has to step forward. This is where the UN can no longer be a political organisation, where it has to see that these human rights abuses are actually taking place, and they need to send in peacekeeping.
Well, in a world of these things, not even the Russian president doesn't know what's happening.
Exactly.
He does.
Exactly.
Will, thanks very much indeed. We'll get us. In a country where the number of cars is rising and parking spaces are in short supply, the idea of a row breaking out about parking is not so very rare. But what if such a row ends in murder, even if the entire neighbourhood was united in trying to get the antisocial resident responsible removed? It's a question prompted by neighbours who did everything they could to stop antisocial behaviour becoming something worse. Many of them installed CCTV cameras outside their homes, this in a village outside Tewkesbury in Gloucestershire. In October, those cameras recorded footage which this week helped secure a murder conviction against Turkish national Kars Aslan, whose antisocial behaviour had been repeatedly reported to police. The footage you're about to show, and I apologise if you find it distressing, shows neighbours using, amongst other things, golf clubs. This is an off-duty police officer with a plank of wood seeking to ward off Arslan, who had just fatally stabbed one resident 27 times, stabbing him in the face, the head and the body, before attacking two others. The family of the dead man, married father Matthew Borman, say not enough was done to evict Arslan from his rented property. At the time of the murder, Arslan was under an injunction banning him from threatening his neighbours, some of whom he'd threatened to kill or rape. Arslan made counter-allegations accusing neighbours of racially abusing him. Well, the bad blood with neighbours had started with a row about parked cars. The case has been referred to the police watchdog. Arslan will be sentenced in June. Well, whatever the sentence, the case raises questions, I think, about how to stop antisocial behaviour spiralling out of control. Joining me now, the homeless charity campaigner Nick Buckley, who has strong views on how to police antisocial behaviour. I suspect, Nick, because you will feel, as many of our viewers and listeners will do, that antisocial behaviour, when it's really bad and life-changing for people, it's happening in places that the commentariat rarely see, on rough council estates and poor housing where there are vulnerable, chaotic families and things are spiralling in an antisocial direction.
Yeah, and they're the sort of estates I've been working in the last 2 decades. So I've seen this close up. I've seen so many arguments and so many disputes over parking, because all our estates were really built for no cars or for 1 car per household. And now cars have 3-4 cars per household. So this sort of thing happens all the time. But this really is an exceptional case. You know, they don't normally lead to somebody with obvious mental health issues here going out and stabbing their neighbours. I've not heard of this before over car parking.
No, I mean, but what's apparent if following this case is that sense of powerlessness that people felt there. The family appearing outside the court and saying the police ignored this for too long. They'd been phoned the day before and were told that this man was making death threats. But here was actually quite a tightly knit community. They were working together. They sought this man's eviction. I just wonder, you know, you see people trying to remove the bad apples, people who've got antisocial behaviour problems. I mentioned in my introduction there was an injunction. There are some legal remedies, but when it comes to it, actually, if somebody's determined to be antisocial, sometimes people sadly have to lump it.
They don't have to lump it, but they have to be ready for a long-term fight and battle with the police and with the council. People class this sort of thing as low-level, and they call it low-level antisocial behaviour. They're arguing over car park spaces. They're arguing over the kids screaming and shouting or playing football in the street. So the police tend not to take it too seriously because they think they have better things to do. The council usually think the same sort of things. And what you get told is report it. Report every incident and we'll build up a picture. But then after the 5th, 6th, 7th time of you reporting antisocial behaviour and nothing has still been done and no one's phoned you back, no one's seen you, you say to yourself, they're not going to do anything. So you give up. And what many councils do, especially since the cuts to services, is lots of these services now have been designed, slightly designed, to stop people reporting stuff. They make it hard for you, so you stop reporting because they haven't got the money to spend to solve all the problems. And what I tell people all the time, if you're not happy with a service, with the council or the police, what you should do after 1 or 2 phone calls is you report it to your local councillor. And if they don't do anything about it, after another couple of reports, you then contact your MP and you start making a fuss because, believe me, the council or police will act when they start getting complaints from their local MP, and they will pull their finger out and hopefully they will do something about it. But if you're quiet and you're sensible and you stop reporting, jobs are good and they just ignore you.
Yeah, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, they say in America, don't they? And I think it's broadly true. Nick Buckley, as ever, thanks very much for your time. Thanks a lot. Coming up after the break, the historian and GB News presenter Neil Oliver will join me to talk about decolonising the curriculum. But first, we've got a short break.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss, and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
"4. 5 years ago, feminists successfully lobbied the Bank of England to change the £10 note. They wanted the tenner to feature the face of Jane Austen, the best-loved and celebrated author, I think many would agree, in the history of English literature. But whatever her literary merits, Jane Austen is also a product of the Regency era, and in the eyes of some, that makes her guilty by association. The Daily Telegraph reporting today that Stirling University had dropped Austen from an English literature syllabus. She would be replaced by a black American author. The paper said the move had its roots in the institution's desire to decolonise the curriculum. I have to say, having looked again at that story, I think it's probably slightly overwritten, but it does raise some important questions about how we venerate or otherwise some of our important, nay, even towering literary figures. Here's one, the historian and GBNews presenter Neil Oliver. Neil, welcome to you. I think it's fair to say we both had some misgivings about the way that story was written up, and actually there was definitely a strong kernel of truth to it, this idea that Austen was part of a rotating module of a syllabus. She was ousted. Toni Morrison was brought in. OK, you could put that down to a matter of evolving literary tastes, but it's undeniably true, isn't it? We've seen it time and time again. There appears to be a desire to repudiate parts of our literary history and import other people's.
Yes, indeed. I think it seems to me this is all a part of a bigger picture in which everything about being British, British culture, British heritage, our history, the history of empire, it's all increasingly being portrayed always and only as a negative, always and only as a bad thing. And it reaches its tentacles into academia, where decisions are being made about which, in this case, in an English literature course at Stirling University, which authors will be studied and which won't. I mean, as you rightly said, as I understand it, this particular course is one that annually rotates the authors, and so one being out this year and another one being in next year, I think is par for the course. And obviously, I mean, someone like Toni Morrison, who is in while Austen is out. You know, I mean, Toni Morrison won she won the Pulitzer in the late 80s, and then she won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I don't think anybody's impugning or suggesting that she's not absolutely an author worthy of consideration. But yes, I think this whole idea of decolonising curriculums, if that's not the stupidest idea that academia has ever had, I would say it's definitely in the top one.
Yeah. Well, I'd add another one to your list of one, and that is and I think this is one of the reasons why people are now suspicious of the academy to some degree. I can think of several stories in the last few months. I won't name the universities, but you'll remember the trigger warnings that were added to books like 1984 or Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist. And that sows the seeds of doubt, scepticism and suspicion about how high-minded higher education is.
Yeah, that's there, I think, in the coverage of the Stirling University story. I think that the broader context for the way in which that particular course has been modified this year, has within it that there are mention of the fact that there are trigger warnings, where students of English literature are being forewarned that depending on what they read, they might come across, and I think I quote, colonial violence. The very idea, my wife read English literature and language at Glasgow University, when I was at the same university in the 1980s. My daughter is now reading English literature and language at Edinburgh University. And almost by definition, when you go into a course to study the world's literature, if some of it doesn't shock you, confront you with challenging ideas, if it doesn't bring you face to face with ideas you've never had, ideas with which you vehemently disagree, then I would say that the course is falling short. The whole excitement about literature is that it should bring you into contact with ideas and styles of writing that that you've never been confronted with before. That's surely the whole joy of it. And I would never subtract. Why would you take out a figure as influential as Austen? Why don't you just bring more characters in so that Austen would be being read alongside an author like Toni Morrison? Surely that broadens the picture.
And I'm sure, Neil, your wife and your daughter will testify, and I speak as a former English literature student myself, there's usually time in the syllabus for English literature students to squeeze a bit more reading in. Neil, thanks very much indeed. Thanks a lot. Let's bring you the latest news headlines with Simon now.
Thanks, Colin. It's 4:35. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister says the 1.25% rise in national insurance is unquestionably right for our country and the NHS. Britain's tax burden has now increased to its highest point in 70 years. The government says £39 billion will be raised over the next 3 years, helping to reduce the NHS backlog. Vladimir Putin's daughters are among those being sanctioned by the US over Russia's alleged war crimes in Ukraine. In a new round of measures announced this afternoon, the US says it's targeting Russian financial institutions as well as Kremlin officials and their family members. The Russian president's 2 adult daughters are the latest to be named. The UK has imposed sanctions on Russia's largest bank, Sberbank. It's also committed to end all imports of Russian coal and oil by the end of this year. It follows Ukraine's president calling for more rigid sanctions as he spoke to the Irish Parliament. The Prime Minister says biological males should not compete in women's sports. Speaking during a visit to a hospital, Boris Johnson said to him it seems sensible. It's after he defended the government's decision not to include trans people in the proposed ban on conversion therapy. And P&O Ferries says it's getting ready to resume services on suspended routes from this weekend. It's after 800 workers were sacked on March the 17th and key trips were cancelled. The journeys back in action will include the Dover to Calais and the Hull to Rotterdam crossings. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Brazier.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's Humanitarian Appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
22 minutes to 5, let's get into it. New YouGov polling carried out on behalf of the think tank These Islands. It's highlighting a series of problems potentially facing the SNP in their push for a second independence referendum. We'll take you through some of the parts of the poll now. In a graphic, only 36% of those polled supported another independence referendum. It's slightly dependent on the wording, as these things often do. 53% not backing Scottish independence. 22% of those supporting secession will not back it if that were to mean public resources are cut and if the question is framed as leave Remain, and then 59% would vote Remain and only 41% leave. My point about the wording mattering. Well, this takes us to today's debate. It's one we at times have had often, not so recently, perhaps that tells you something. Has support for Scottish independence peaked? Joining us for that debate, the General Secretary of the Alba Party, Christopher McElhenney, and the Conservative commentator, James Bundy. Gentlemen, thanks for your time. We do appreciate it. Christopher McElhenney, to you first. Has it peaked, and if so, why?
No, it's not peaked. If I take you back to when Alex Salmond secured the Edinburgh Agreement in 2012, support for independence was on the high 20s, low 30%. Throughout that referendum campaign, that positive message that was put forward, we managed to take support for independence up to 45%. So, I mean, you quote some figures there, so we're still pretty much in that ballpark. If not, I think, from the conversations I have, I would say that we're sitting more likely 50-50. And I think that once we actually get on with the job of having an independence campaign, I would be confident that we would see support for independence increase into the 50s, if not into the 60%, because the world's changed since 2014. We've got Boris Johnson's Prime Minister, we've had Brexit. All of the arguments of the Better Together campaign have completely imploded. And I think now that it's a completely different argument going forward.
James Bundy, is it a different argument? And if you put the question again, what answer would you get?
I think if you asked the question now, you would still get no to independence. And I say that because the polls recently have been going in a clear trend where support of the union has been going up slightly and support for independence is going down. But I do think we have to take some caution within these polls, and we can't just rest on our laurels for those who support being part of the United Kingdom. The case continuously has to be made. And we just need to keep up the good fight and try and deviate away from the constitutional question as well. Scotland has been a bit of powerless for the past 10, 15 years with an independence referendum, then Brexit, then COVID. So now we just need to have a period of time where we focus on the everyday issues, the NHS backlog, improving the standards of education in Scotland, improving the police services. These are the conversations that people are, when I'm on the doorsteps, people want to start talking about these things rather than going over and over a constitutional debate that was settled in 2014.
Well, it's interesting. Christopher McElhenney, we didn't have time for it in our graphic, but I'm just going to mention it now verbally. The poll did, and I know you can get polls to say things sometimes, but it was quite interesting, I thought, that the economy was still coming out as the deepest misgiving people had about independence. According to the survey, second, EU membership. Third, the state pension. We'll remember that Ian Blackford at Westminster suggested the UK would pick up the tab for the Scots state pension. And the fourth one was hard border between England and Scotland. About 20% of people said they were worried about that, really worried about it.
Yeah, well, I think if Ian Blackford had read the Wee Alba book, which we released last week, he wouldn't have got himself into such a muddle over such a simple matter as pensions with his ludicrous position. The number one issue at the moment, regardless of where you live on these islands, is the cost of living crisis. And that's, the key driver of the economy at the moment. And why does that matter to the constitutional question? Because people right now will be asking themselves, why do I live in a country like Scotland, which is energy rich, it's self-sufficient in gas, we generate enough renewable electricity to power every home in Scotland if we wanted to do so. But people are seeing their bills rise by thousands upon thousands of pounds. Contrast that to France, where there's a clear energy price cap in the single percents. But EDF energy prices in the UK have went up by over 50%. Well, Scotland must be the only energy-rich country in the history of the world that people face rising energy bills when we've got such an overabundance of energy.
They've got a different approach, haven't they? 70% of their energy is produced by nuclear. I mean, James Bundy, is the in fact, I was going to talk about the unionist argument apropos energy. I don't want to do that. I want to focus on this question, and I speak as somebody who is. I think we need to be open about those things. If I was living in Scotland and got to vote, I would vote to stay in the union. I consider myself to be a unionist. And I've been disappointed since the IndyRef won that London hasn't done more to really sell the union and actually make the positive case for how we are better together. And it seems to me they felt they got it over the line and then they forgot all about it, which is exactly, I think, why we're in the situation we are, where there are so many people like Christopher who, have arguably very justifiable complaints.
No, yes, I think that's totally right. And I think David Cameron made a massive blunder when he talked about English votes for English laws the morning after the referendum vote. That should have been a celebration of keeping our country united, and then talking about how the United Kingdom government was going to continue improving the lives of people living in Scotland. Since the Brexit vote, there have been new initiatives by the UK government. So the UK government is now directly investing in Scotland, communities throughout Scotland, in a way that hasn't been seen since the devolution settlement started. So these projects are just getting off the ground, and once the results are seen by the people of Scotland, I think they will start to see the benefits in their daily lives of being part of a United Kingdom. But as I agree, it's not only the UK government, the UK Labour Party as well. They all have to make the positive case for a United Kingdom. And we have not been doing a good enough job collectively as a UK, the UK Conservatives, UK Labour Party. We've not been doing a good enough job collectively. But hopefully that will change. And I think it is starting to change for the better.
Christopher McElhenney, just in terms of tactics, does the presence of your party, the ALBA party, does it split the secessionist vote, or does it augment it?
No, not at all. But you did make a very good point yourself there. I'd gladly like to see you live in Scotland, but you don't live in Scotland, so you don't get a vote. If you did live in Scotland, you would appreciate that. You would live in a country that
there are 800,000 people of Scots heritage living in England who don't get a vote either.
You would realise that you see out of your bedroom window weapons of mass destruction. So that's, obviously when you look at things through a London lens, perhaps you get a London view and thing. But the benefit of the ALBA party is that, as I mentioned to you a minute ago, the wee ALBA book, we're taking the case for independence to communities across Scotland. The SNP, sadly, have allowed Boris Johnson, the weakest, most woeful, most deceitful Prime Minister in history, to get off scot-free. They won a historic mandate again with a record amount of votes last year at the Scottish Parliament elections. In fact, there was a majority of votes cast for independence, and we've allowed that mandate to sit dormant. Whereas ALBA, we're making that case that we need independence now as an immediate priority.
Okay.
And why do we need it? I'll give you one example. During COVID, what did Ireland do? They went to the bond market, they raised billions of euros to deal with the COVID crisis. What did we do in Scotland? We had to wait for the UK Chancellor to decide that people in England...
Scotland did benefit from the Oxford vaccine.
The world benefited from the Oxford vaccine. It's quite parochial to suggest that just because Oxford University is in England, it somehow belongs to England, it belongs to the world. And I think it's been a very successful programme. But, you like to gloss over that point. The furlough scheme was ended across the UK until people in the southeast of England needed furlough, and that's the only reason it was extended in Scotland, because we don't have the financial levers to put in place decisions like that ourselves.
We're almost out of time. James Bundy, we're going to give you the last word. Christopher, thanks very much for your thoughts. Christopher McElhenney there saying Boris Johnson, toxic in Scotland, divisive, deceitful, etc. Christopher's in a party led by Alex Salmond. Your thoughts?
Well, yes, Alex Salmond might be one of the few politicians in Scotland more unpopular than Boris Johnson. But yeah, Boris, we all know that he's not the most popular politician up here. But again, that should be quite worrying for the SNP and ALBA, that they are still not getting ahead in the polls. Their actual support's decreasing. The whole proposition is we're facing Brexit, we're facing a Tory government of 12 years, we're facing Boris Johnson, so why aren't you ahead in the polls? If you can't be winning now, then I would be worried for your proposition.
Gentlemen, got to leave it there. Appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Now, has Elon Musk, the world's richest man, bought himself a seat on the board of Twitter? Shares in the social media platform let by a quarter after Musk bought 9.2% of the company. His acquisition, it also provoked a flurry of speculation. Musk is a self-declared free speech absolutist. Does that mean he'll use his board position to attempt to rescind the Twitter ban on President Trump? I'll put that thought to Emma Webb in just a second. But first, we'll discuss this with the CEO of Getter and a former spokesman for President Trump, who joins us now, Jason Miller. Jason, thanks for your time. Do appreciate it. Were you surprised when Elon Musk did this?
Well, I've learned never to be surprised by Elon Musk. After all, he's gone from building Teslas to launching rocket ships into outer space and eventually possibly even Mars. And I've also learned to never bet against Elon Musk. Here is the challenge, though, is that Twitter's brand is fundamentally broken, at least here in the United States, and I think around much of the world. And even though it might be this great tool, this great technology, they've made it such a vehicle for wokeism and political cancel culture that I don't even know if the great Elon Musk will be able to save it. Here's the good thing. The good thing is this is shining a big, bright spotlight now on big tech censorship, on big tech discrimination. So I think can only be an upside, whatever Musk attempts to do.
Of your Getter backdrop there, I mean, you've got a commercial angle on this, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's have more competition. Getter provides a rival platform. That's wonderful. Is it one way of looking at this, which says we're so used now to a cultural narrative that says that big business is woke, they stifle on the free speech absolutism I just introduced there from Elon Musk. But actually, here's an illustration of somebody who's got incredibly rich, world's wealthiest man, by dint of their wits, ideas and hard labour. And actually, he's able to use capitalism to buy a lumpy bit of Twitter, 10% of it thereabouts, a seat on the board, and maybe influence things in a direction we're not used to.
Well, so that's what we would hope. And obviously, we've seen that Musk has been very outspoken. I think he's someone who's much more libertarian, who wants to give people that freedom of speech. Again, his challenge, though, is the culture at Twitter is to oppose true free speech. In fact, they've already said from Twitter that they will not allow President Trump back on their platform, no matter what. Even with Musk being on the board of directors, even though he now is the single largest shareholder, 4 times as large of a shareholder as Jack Dorsey, for example. So there's going to be a real knockdown, drag out that is coming. But when I said that it's a win-win, either A, if Musk is able to get Trump reinstated on Twitter, which they're saying is not going to happen. And I think really that is the threshold that Musk has to clear to get a lot of Trump supporters to consider going back on. Or B, it continues to shine a spotlight on Twitter and it gives more focus on the fact there are other platforms, mine included, but also platforms such as Rumble, obviously President Trump's own Truth Social, Parler, a number of others that people can go to. Ultimately, what we want to make sure is that people have free speech, the flow of information is decentralized, and at some point, we're going to have to get past this nasty game of wokeism and cancel culture if we want to survive as a society.
Jason Miller, you make the stakes sound remarkably high, and I think a lot of people will agree with you. Thanks for your time, appreciate it. Emma Webbe is alongside me here in the studio to reflect on that. Jason Miller says the litmus test of what difference, if any, Elon Musk makes to Twitter is whether the ban on President Trump is rescinded. He's got to be right, hasn't he, on that?
I think that's part of it. I think many people will be hoping, as Jason Miller said there, that Elon Musk is very libertarian. He leans very much in the direction of free speech. Elon Musk is rich enough to have bought the entirety of Twitter if he'd wanted to. But the fact that he's chosen to invest his money in this way, I think, suggests that maybe there will be some kind of power struggle within Twitter, and that may be a power struggle away from cancel culture and towards free speech, which I think would be very welcome. Partly because one of the problems of, as you say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, competition is a very good thing. But if you end up with lots of individual echo chambers, that isn't good for free speech either. And I think because Twitter so much has become the public square, this is one of the reasons why Elon Musk has expressed interest in it, it's important that Twitter is somewhere where democratic values have a grip, and free speech is fundamental to that. And so it's important that there is a diversity of opinions expressed on that platform because it's the biggest platform of its kind.
Musk says he's a free speech absolutist. Just so people can sense where you are on this. I mean, would you allow Putin a Twitter account? Would you allow should the Taliban keep theirs? I mean, where are you on the spectrum?
I think probably I would be described as a free speech absolutist because I believe that short of things like incitement and actually breaking the law, then people should be able to express their opinions on any variety of matters. I also think it's important for views to be aired in the open because sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think that chasing people's views and debates and discussions underground and into private isn't good because it means that we don't understand what people are thinking.
You know what your problem is there, don't you? That there are those who will say on Twitter and elsewhere that actually Trump did break the law when it came to the January 6 demonstrations. A question for another time. Let's move on to something a bit closer to home. There are signs that the latest wave of COVID infections may have peaked in children and younger adults. This is according to scientists tracking the outbreak. But rates in those older groups who are most susceptible to severe disease, they are continuing to increase, at least in England. Let's ponder this with the NHS GP, Dr. Veena Babu. Veena, welcome to you. That's what the big data analysis is saying, that in young people, in children, the peak has passed. What are you seeing on the ground?
Exactly what you just said. I think it's also because there are more tests being available. I think in the last few weeks, before they stopped giving out tests, we were testing way more than we were before. So I'm not surprised that the data actually shows that positive tests are in correlation with frequency of tests being given. So that's exactly what we're seeing on the ground. I do have to agree.
In terms of, I know we talk about this regularly, but I think it's really important to people, and they want to know from a GP who's actually seeing it. Where are we now? I mean, on the day that we're seeing the health and social levy brought in, yes, for social care, but also to boost spending on the NHS, how are those backlogs looking right now, and the availability of face-to-face appointments?
They're actually a lot better. And I say that even now to get on to speak to you. I had, my clinic overran. I was rushed off from work just so I could make this on time, and I nearly missed this slot because we're seeing that many patients face to face. And I can speak 100% based on the clinics that I work in. Of course, like we've discussed on previous occasions, Colin, different practices work a bit differently, but I'm definitely seeing at least 8 to 15 patients per clinic every day.
Wow. And when, I don't know if anybody ever does, press you on the topic of NHS funding, all kinds of things happen at GP surgery. How do you justify the fact that we're all going to be paying, really quite a lot more at a time of rising cost of living? There are those people who say we just can't afford the level of expenditure on health that we currently do.
I would agree with them, because even when the £2 lateral flow tests were announced, cost of living for everyone is going up. And that's not a small issue. We're talking about people who sometimes struggle to put food on the table. So this is a matter of concern. And we never did one test at a time. So to think about people who need to test regularly, that £2 one-off price will add up. So I completely empathize with where they're coming from. I would say that it's not a rule that's set in cement. It's not something that's solidified. So if there is a window where in the future cases are rising and there's more adverse cases, I think the government will open a window to give free tests again. So hope is not completely lost, and we're on the ground fighting this day to day, and things are looking better. But I completely empathize with what they're saying.
Veena Babu, as ever. Veena, thanks very much indeed.
Thanks, Colin.
Emma Webb's alongside me. COVID peak. Okay, it's a statistical landmark milestone, maybe. I observe, even here where I work, people are much more relaxed about the regulations, which 6 months ago would have had them frit.
Thank goodness for it. I'm so happy to see people taking a more relaxed attitude to it and being reasonable and making their own risk assessments and taking individual responsibility, as I think it should have been from the very beginning. I also, though, think that though this is probably not true of some parts of the population, I think that people's attention has been distracted by the war in Ukraine, by the wall-to-wall coverage of something other than COVID for a change. And so I think that has a part to play, because people were very frightened into adhering to those really strict measures. And now they're being less frightened because they've got something else to be frightened about, possible nuclear war.
Yeah, exactly. Emma, for now, thanks very much indeed. Do take a look at our Twitter poll this afternoon. It concerns the Duchess of Sussex and the word archetype. You'll read it, you'll see what we mean. It's time for the break.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Hi there, welcome to Brazier. Coming up live at 5, the latest on Ukraine and today's big NHS tax hike. Plus, former Trump advisor Dr. Seb Gorka joins me to wonder out loud why BLM's leaders needed to buy a mansion, a purchase they preferred to keep quiet. Also, why is a poll today showing the Tories are no longer the party of the countryside? Is it because the values gap between rural and urban is no longer what it was? And the brilliant royal author Robert Hardman will ponder on why the Duchess of Sussex is seeking to patent a widely used word from the English language. Guess which one it is? Alongside me on today's show, the commentator Emma Webb. But first, the latest news headlines with Simon.
Thanks, Colin. Good afternoon. It's just gone 5 o'clock. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister says the 1.25% rise in national insurance is unquestionably right for our country and the NHS. The increase means Britain's tax burden has now risen to its highest point in 70 years, impacting the income of millions of households. The government predicts £39 billion will be raised over the next 3 years. Boris Johnson says it will help reduce the NHS waiting lists.
Most important thing is to have a strong, robust economy in which you have a high level of security in your employment, in which people know that there's a long-term plan to deliver jobs and growth.
Meanwhile, the Chancellor's popularity with voters has declined as the cost of living continues to soar. A YouGov survey found Rishi Sunak's net favourability has dropped 24 points in the last fortnight since he made the spring statement. Earlier, campaigners dressed up as the Chancellor outside the Treasury office in London, protesting the rise in national security. A security guard at the British Embassy in Berlin, suspected of spying for Russia, has been extradited from Germany to the UK. David Smith was arrested by German police last August and is accused of collecting information to pass on to the Russian state. The 57-year-old is expected to appear in Westminster Magistrates Court tomorrow. Vladimir Putin's daughters are among those being sanctioned by the US over Russia's alleged war crimes in Ukraine. In a new round of sanctions announced this afternoon, the US says it's targeting Russian financial institutions as well as Kremlin officials and their family members. The Russian president's 2 adult daughters are the latest to be named. Boris Johnson says what's happening in Bucha and other revelations from Ukraine doesn't look far short of genocide. Ukrainian officials say at least 410 bodies have been discovered in Bucha and other towns around Kyiv. Speaking ahead of a NATO meeting of foreign ministers, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says he believes war crimes have been committed.
We have all seen the atrocities that have been committed in Bucha and other places in Ukraine. This reveals the true nature of President Putin's war. Any targeting and killing of civilians is a war crime, and therefore NATO allies are supporting the international efforts to establish all the facts, to investigate and to make sure that perpetrators are punished.
Jens Stoltenberg there. Well, earlier the Ukrainian president spoke to the Irish Parliament and called for more sanctions. Volodymyr Zelensky says Russia is using hunger as a weapon and deliberately creating a food crisis.
I'd like to ask you to convince EU partners to introduce even more rigid sanctions against Russia that would really make sure that the Russian war machine will stop. The only thing is that we're lacking is the principal approach of some leaders, political leaders, business leaders, who still think that war and war crimes is not something as horrific as financial losses.
The Prime Minister says biological males should not compete in women's sports. Speaking during a visit to a hospital, Boris Johnson said to him it seems sensible. It's after he defended the government's decision not to include trans people in the proposed ban on conversion therapy. He added there were complexities and sensitivities which needed to be worked through. P&O Ferries says it's getting ready to resume services on suspended routes from this weekend. It's after 800 workers were sacked on March the 17th and key trips had to be cancelled. The journeys back in action will include the Dover to Calais and the Hull to Rotterdam crossings. And Ed Sheeran has called for the end of baseless claims against songwriters. It's after today where he won a high court battle in the copyright case of his single Shape of You. Ed Sheeran has insisted he's always trying to be completely fair in crediting people who contribute to his albums. Posting on social media after the verdict, the singer said claims like this are too common and are damaging to the songwriting industry. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now, though, it's back to Brazier.
Well, just listening to Simon do the story in the bulletin there made me reconsider what we ought to start with today, and we'll come on to Ukraine in just a second, but I think it will occur to a lot of people, and as I look through some of the news websites, I think it's occurring to a lot of journalists as well, that the Prime Minister's intervention today in the burning culture war topic of the age to some degree, what is a woman, what is a man, and all points in between. It's a really significant intervention. Just to recap what he said, this in an interview with Sam Coates of Sky News. He said that there ought to be safe spaces in hospitals, prisons, changing rooms for women. It's been campaigned for, resisted by some. Biological males, we did a story early this week, certainly last week, about a cyclist who was competing unfairly in the eyes of some against women. Leah Thomas, the other example from the world of swimming in America, has brought that onto the front pages. Prime Minister says biological males should not compete in women's sport, emphatic about that, and that children should not be allowed to choose their own gender without the assistance/authorisation of their parents. Emma Webb, the commentator, is alongside me. Emma, how big a deal?
I think this is a huge deal, and it just goes to show how powerful the grassroots campaigning has been on this issue, because it's only in the last week that a group of women, including Caroline Fisk and Maya Forstater, who famously won her own case to protect her, as they put it, gender-critical beliefs, in an employment tribunal, that these women have come together and said that if you want my vote, then you have to protect my sex, you have to protect women's rights. And I think this is extremely important on a number of issues. And it just goes to show that that grassroots pressure can go a long way, that now the Prime Minister is coming out and supporting women's rights, while all other politicians, including from the Labour Party, have been equivocating about this for months.
It's naked politics, isn't it?
Absolutely.
The Prime Minister's seen the main chance, he's looked at the poll ratings, he's looked at Keir Starmer struggling to decide what a woman should be defined as being. Angela Rayner, others had too. And he sees a gap in the market. You could be, to be cynical.
Yeah, I think to be cynical on this would probably be quite right. He's seen which way the wind has been blowing. A lot of pressure has been coming, surprisingly, from the opposite direction. For a long time, the pressure has been put on by lobby groups like Stonewall in favour of essentially eroding women's rights and their right to safe same-sex spaces, particularly for vulnerable women. And now we're seeing that the pressure is being piled on in the other direction, because women are finally stepping up and saying, actually, no, we're not going to stand for this. And it's being compared to a new movement of the same importance as the suffragettes. And I think it's, whether it's cynical or not, it's important that the Prime Minister has said this, because he can be held to it in the future.
Yeah. Emma, for now, thanks very much indeed. Now, the Czech Republic, or Czechia, as actually it likes to be known, has become the first NATO country to send tanks to Ukraine. It risks the ire of Russia by sending T-72 main battle tanks, as well as armoured infantry APCs, armoured personnel carriers, to Ukrainian soldiers, following a plea for assistance from President Zelensky. Let's turn to the retired British military officer, Tim Cross, who can ponder on this one for us. Tim Cross, welcome to you. Will these tanks make a difference?
Yeah, I think they will. I don't know the numbers, to be honest, and I don't know what condition they're in. The important thing is that the
Ukrainian military are used to using this equipment. That we're not selling them Western equipment they've never trained in or used before. So yes, it is important. I mean, getting them there and making sure they arrive in the battlefield without being interdicted by Russian air or something is not going to be easy. But yeah, I think it will make a difference.
Yeah, and it reminds us, doesn't it, that we're moving perhaps into a phase which isn't just about Ukrainian soldiers elegantly retreating, but potentially actually taking ground from the Russians.
Yeah, and that's an important change. Defensive operations are, not easy, but relatively easy compared to offensive operations. There's a mantra in military circles, which is you need a 3-to-1 advantage to take ground, to be in offensive operations. So for every Ukrainian that's been sitting in the eastern provinces, for example, defending their territory over the last 8 years, the Russians would need to have been throwing 3 people at each one of them. If the Ukrainians are going to move on to offensive operations, they will need to put in place that same level of a scale of people. So they're going to need 3-to-1 advantage in people, and they're going to need a lot more equipment and offensive capability equipment, like heavy metal, heavy armor. Now, that armor is as susceptible to anti-tank weapons as the Russian armor has been. And we've seen the impact of the NLAW and other weapons that we, the UK, and others have sent to Ukraine. So conducting operations offensively will take more combat power. It's a different way of fighting. It's a different doctrine. It's not as easy. And, we hope that they will be able to do it successfully. But the Russians, if they find themselves, fighting defensively, they may well be able to hold ground.
Tim Cross, I just want to reflect finally on those pictures, those scenes, those images from Bucha and elsewhere. Is it true that all badly led armies eventually succumb to the lowest common denominator of warfare and do all the things that we're currently witnessing? Or is there something unusual about what's happened in Bucha? Answer that question if you can. And also just in terms of the leadership, what message that sends out to the Ukrainians, that they know if they surrender, they might be executed, and that will actually make them fight all the more lustily, won't it?
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, sadly, if I'm honest, nothing is surprising emerging from what's going on in Ukraine. War crimes and the way people badly treat each other and so forth is just a reality of any war. I mean, you only need to look back to the Balkans, to Iraq, obviously to World War II and so on. So we're not seeing anything unusual in that sense here. The distinction is between whether or not it's being done by individual soldiers tactically on the ground who are badly led and, as you say, have been badly trained, and who haven't been trained, haven't been educated in things like the law of armed conflict, rules of engagement, Geneva Conventions and so on. And that happens on the ground in most operations. And to be honest, no one side is going to be invulnerable to that. There will be incidents of people behaving badly on the battlefield. The question is whether or not, from an operational level, campaign plan level, the commanders have either instructed, ordered people to treat them this way, or they have simply failed to prepare them properly for it. So it is difficult to prove one way or the other. I think, indicting people and so forth isn't going to be easy. I think I've said before in this program that I was a witness in The Hague for some of the indictments in the Balkans. These things take a long time to pull together, and finding the reality of what's been happening isn't going to be easy. But it is pretty obvious that some terrible things have been happening. And your second point is, of course, if you hear that being taken prisoner could well result in you being badly treated, if not killed, then it's going to make people fight the harder. Again, to be honest, there's been nothing new in that. A lot of examples of that from previous wars and campaigns. So the publicity that's coming to this across the media and obviously within Ukraine is certainly not going to make people fight any the less hard. It'll make them want to resist even stronger if they needed that incentive in the first place, which probably they didn't, is the truth.
Tim Cross, as ever, thanks very much indeed for your time. Appreciate it. Emma Webbe is alongside me. Tim Cross is a retired general. You're a sort of political, cultural commentator. I suppose he knows whereof he speaks, but it's disappointing nonetheless, isn't it? We sort of assume, we hope, that in an evolving world where we share the same products, the same memes online, that somehow the worst aspects of human behaviour, men in particular, will have somehow been banished. It ain't so.
I think ultimately we've been mistaken to think that in the modern world that those darker aspects of human nature have somehow been expunged by technological advancement, and that we are in some way morally superior, even to our, forefathers who fought in World War II. I think that's completely mistaken, and so we should always expect human beings to behave in a way that is dark and disgraceful.
Yeah, that's war. Emma, thanks very much. From today, millions of Britons are going to be paying more tax as national insurance payments increase 1.25% in the pound. It's a massive rise. But might it actually make future raids on the taxpayer to fund an ever-increasing NHS budget more difficult? I ask because the Health and Social Care Levy, to give this national insurance hike its proper name, is what's called in the jargon a hypothecated tax, or just about. In other words, it's a tax which produces receipts allotted to just one type of spending, in this case, the health service. So if future governments decide that we need to spend tens of billions more on the NHS, people, in theory, will have a much clearer sense of what that means for their pay packets. Let's turn to the businessman and former Brexit Party MEP, Ben Habib, who can reflect on this for us now. Ben Habib, welcome to you. I mean, I'm rather overstating the case there, because obviously the NHS tax take is gigantic and most of it's covered by general taxation. But there's just a sign here that the government's maybe beginning to signal to people, just look how much you spend on the NHS.
Well, it could be. And I mean, it's interesting that you regard that potentially as a hypothecated tax. I don't think it's in legislation in that way. And it would be remarkable if the government actually did with the money what it said it was going to do. I mean, what happens in reality with taxation on the whole is the government collects it and then it applies it as it sees best at that point in time. I know it's used the NHS and social care system as an excuse for this increase in national insurance. But whether or not the money actually ends up there remains to be seen. And it is, in my view, at this juncture of our recovery coming out of lockdowns, I think it's completely the wrong tax to be levying. You've got to remember that lockdowns was a massive break on business. Government debt went up dramatically during lockdowns and the private sector was kicked in the shins. The only way out of this massive overhang of government debt is for the private sector to recover, for the British economy to grow, and for tax receipts to go up. That does not happen by burdening individuals with more national insurance. It does not happen by increasing corporation tax rates, which is what's taking place. Actually, it happens when you cut the tax take. Counterintuitively, cutting taxes now is what the government should be doing to get businesses back on the front foot so that the economy can grow, and on the back of that, we can grow our way out of this huge debt burden. We can't do what George Osborne did after rescuing the banks, which is go into a kind of semi-austerity mode. And I'm afraid the increase in national insurance is a really material step in the wrong direction as we come out of lockdown.
But in the short term, you'd have to borrow to bridge the gap between what you're spending and what you're bringing in taxes.
We would have to borrow. And if you think about it like this a bit, Colin, we borrowed £500 billion to lock down the economy. It makes sense that we would probably have to reduce the burden on business and individuals by a similar amount as we come out in order to get back to where we were. There's a symmetry there which seems to be lost on the government. And we've got good experience now about how to deal with significant economic setbacks. You look at what happened in 2008. We had a massive credit crunch. The banks were bailed out. The Bank of England printed lots of money. Government debt went up. And then George Osborne, without really thinking it through, went into automatic Tory thinking, which was to raise taxes, go on an austerity drive, and try and somehow balance the books by cutting debt, cutting expenditure and cutting debt. And when we look back at the last 12 years of that policy, what we see is that GDP in the United Kingdom has actually only risen 17% in dollar terms in 12 years of Conservative government. That is shocking. The US has grown by about 50% over the same period, and our debt has gone up by a factor of 2.5. The only thing that ever gets a country out of a significant debt problem is growth. And the only way to grow is to reduce taxes on what I call turnover. So reduce taxes that hinder business. Business rates is something they should be reducing. National insurance on employers is something they should be reducing, not increasing. Reducing taxes like stamp duty, helping the machine getting going. These are the taxes, VAT is a really good example. VAT take, by the way, is automatically going to go up with inflation as the value of goods increases. The government should be cutting back VAT. It's an absolutely crucial cut that they should be implementing. What Rishi Sunak desperately needs to do is put aside the traditional Tory guidebook on how to come out of a large debt and think about growth. Put growth first, and the books will balance themselves over time. And the way to do it is to cut taxes on turnover.
Ben Habib, as ever, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Leaders of Black Lives Matter, the organisation founded by a self-declared Marxist, have allegedly bought a $6 million mansion using donations. The 6,500 square foot California home, complete with 7 bedrooms, parking spaces for more than 20 cars, and an interesting addendum list, 3 fireplaces. A report from the New York magazine claims that BLM officials tried to keep the existence of the mansion secret. Joining me now, Dr. Sebastian Gorka, the former Deputy Assistant to President Trump and host of the podcast and radio show America First. Seb Gorka, welcome to you. What are BLM doing with all the cash they collected?
As I just tweeted out as I was waiting to come on the show, Colin, this is the empirical evidence that these are indeed, as they call themselves in a video that has now gone viral, highly trained ideological Marxists. Because when a Marxist system is put in place, what happens? The vanguard, quote unquote, the elite, well, they live very, very nicely, thank you very much. So the idea that a mansion where Marilyn Monroe and Frank Sinatra once used to hang out costing $6.5 million is now going to be used for BLM, it tells you that this was never about social justice. This wasn't about power to the people. This was about a coterie of individuals making themselves a lot of money, Colin.
There are still in this country, I dare say, Seb, in the States as well, many people who I think labour under the delusion that this is an organisation of the utmost probity, some of its beginnings, some of that, I mentioned the Marxism, for instance, some of the upturning societal norms, family, patriotism, all that stuff, the nation state, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because actually the only thing that matters is the essential message about racial justice. If you were addressing a message to those HR departments and corporate affairs departments in British firms or American firms who believe the last part of what I said, that BLM is a necessary step when it comes to racial justice, what would you say?
Stop being a useful idiot. This idea, which is inculcated into the very gene code of BLM, is that discrimination is how you stop discrimination. Their statements are essential bigotry. Their argument is that if your skin color is white, you are inherently racist. You are an oppressor. If you are black, if you are colored, if you are minority, you are inherently a victim. Both of those statements, Colin, are racist statements. They are the antithesis of what Reverend Martin Luther King, the great civil rights leader of America, once said. I have a dream that one day my children will be judged upon the content of their character, not their skin color. BLM is the opposite of what MLK called for. It is a racist organization. It is a grift. It is a con. It's about making money off the backs of the average American for a small coterie of Marxists.
And if it's true, and I don't know, that if there is a process, it's not what I've seen. If it's true that it is a grift, as you put it, there has to be an analysis, a probe, an investigation into whether substantial sums have been misappropriated. I mean, that could be an allegation. I don't know. It's a serious one. Where is that process? What is it happening?
Well, not with Joe Biden running the Department of Justice and having his lackey be the Attorney General. Let's be very clear. any investigation into any misappropriation of funds or misrepresentation of this ostensible or putative charity is a very risky thing to do, because the second you ask any reasonable question, what will you be tarred as? Instantly a racist. If we live in a Western civilization where a prime minister has difficulty defining what a woman is, and when a biological woman like J.K. Rowling is absolutely lambasted, is doxxed, is attacked relentlessly because she's standing up for the rights of real women, then the idea that you can have a fair and just investigation of an entity that says it is fighting for social justice, that takes a very courageous individual, and that's not going to happen in this administration in the United States. On the contrary, what they're doing is targeting conservative parents who are standing up at school board meetings saying that thing that BLM likes, critical race theory, is bigotry and mustn't be taught to our children. What happens in response? The Department of Justice writes a letter to the FBI field offices across America, Colin, saying, investigate these parents as potential terrorists. That is the bizarro, upside-down world we live in right now.
Seb Gorka, got to leave it there. Appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Coming up next, we head to the countryside, where the Conservative Party apparently is facing a rural reckoning. First, a short break.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss, and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children, and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's humanitarian appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls, and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate, and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
And now the phrase Shire Tories has long been used to describe a type of voter who was loyal to the Conservative Party and lived in the countryside. But according to polling commissioned by the Country Land and Business Association, rural support for the Tories in England and Wales is falling. Voters were polled in parts of Cornwall, Cumbria, North Yorkshire, Norfolk and Gwynedd, and a lack of affordable housing that emerged top of their list of reasons for losing faith with the Conservatives. Might there be another reason? Is it actually the case that when you think about the counties I just listed, many of them are now home to residents whose values are actually little different from those of city dwellers? Is what once made rural folk Conservative an attachment to work on the land, tradition, self-reliance, and even things like field sports in retreat as villages become part of the commuter belt? Let's turn to the President of the Country Land and Business Association, Mark Tufnell. Mark Tufnell, I appreciate your time. Why the disconnect then between the Conservative Party and people who hitherto have been inclined to vote for them?
Well, Colin, good afternoon. I think the issue really is that the countryside is beginning to almost be forgotten by this current government. We have a levelling up programme. There was a levelling up white paper. There was very little reference within it to rural. There were only 39 references to it in a document of 332 pages. I appreciate there's a rural proofing paper coming out. I appreciate there are changes coming forward to the planning regime, and there will be in May a government report on food strategy. But I just think that within the rural countryside, perhaps we are being forgotten by the government. And it's not just farming. 85% of businesses in the countryside don't relate to farming. And those businesses are feeling unloved.
I wonder if the government isn't a bit more of a weather vane when it comes to the reactions of the rural community than we're suggesting here. If you think about the wind turbine story, and it's literally of the last fortnight, and we can debate the folly or otherwise of government energy policy, which ought to be looking decades ahead, sort of turning on a dime in a fortnight. But there was a plan floated for a tripling. I think it was coming from the office of Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, for wind turbines, land-based wind turbines, to be tripled. There were rumblings from the shires. The plan's gone.
Well, the government needs a long-term energy strategy, and that's coming out shortly. I think it is disappointing that a long-term plan should change quite so quickly. It was offshore wind turbines, I think the Prime Minister was talking about, and it looks as though more energy will be taken from nuclear power stations. There's already one being produced at Hinkley. There was talking of more. There was a nuclear power station on Anglesey, and there's proposal for another 6 to go forward. So we do need to look at it long term. I think renewable energy, solar panels, wind turbines, as you say, and also air source heat pumps are areas that do need looking at. Government needs further resource and help within the sector. Previously, we've had renewable heat incentives, and we've also had feed-in tariffs. Renewable energy is an important source, but it's a balance within the energy mix, which is why I do think that nuclear energy is something that we will need to look towards.
Mark Tufnell, the sound's not great. We're going to leave it there for now, but thanks very much indeed for your time. Thanks a lot. Emma Webb, the commentator, alongside me. We didn't get round to the question that I was posing in my introduction there, which is, maybe the gap between country and city is less than it was. What say you?
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think particularly in lots of those areas that you say, they're the commuter belts, will be taking on some of those urban values,
especially post-COVID.
Exactly, and people who are able to work from home, who may have been living quite comfortably in the city, able to move out to nice houses in the countryside, people who would be broadly defined as the liberal elite who previously lived within cities. I would be interested to know whether it is possible to find out whether that is one of the reasons behind this polling, because I do think that, even with Partygate, even with the rise in the cost of living and everything, I think that it's still a curious result from this poll. And I'd be very interested to know if that, as you say, that attachment and that love of land that comes with being from a local area within the countryside and feeling that rural attachment, whether the loss of that is partly what is behind this.
It's an interesting question. We don't have an answer to it, but it feels like there's the beginnings of one. I call it serification of the countryside. I think that sums it up rather well. Clever me. Coming up next, we're going to be speaking to the travel expert Simon Calder. There's more travel disruption in parts of the country, the airports, the big Easter holiday getaway that has been quite tricky for many. First, let's bring you up to date with the latest news headlines with Simon.
Hello, it's Simon Pusey. It's just gone 5:30 from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister says the 1.25% rise in national insurance is unquestionably right for our country and the NHS. Britain's tax burden has now increased to its highest point in 70 years. The government says £39 billion will be raised over the next 3 years, helping to reduce the NHS backlog. A security guard at the British Embassy in Berlin, suspected of spying for Russia, has been extradited from Germany to the UK. David Smith was arrested by German police last August and is accused of collecting information to pass on to the Russian state. The 57-year-old is expected to appear in Westminster Magistrates' Court tomorrow. Vladimir Putin's two daughters are among those being sanctioned by the US over Russia's alleged war crimes in Ukraine. In a new round of measures announced this afternoon, the US says it's targeting Russian financial institutions as well as Kremlin officials and their family members. Meanwhile, the UK has also imposed sanctions on Russia's largest bank and is committed to end all imports of Russian coal and oil by the end of this year. The Secretary-General of NATO has thanked the US for what he called outstanding leadership in the face of the war in Ukraine. Welcoming the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken to the latest NATO summit in the last half hour, Jens Stoltenberg said the efforts from the US have been indispensable. The two met ahead of a meeting with foreign ministers today and tomorrow. And the Prime Minister says biological males should not compete in women's sports. Speaking during a visit to a hospital, Boris Johnson said to him it seems sensible. It's after he defended the government's decision not to include trans people in the proposed ban on conversion therapy. TV, online and DAB+ digital, this is GB News. Now it's back to Brazier.
Europe is in the grip of the most devastating humanitarian crisis since World War II.
The people of Ukraine are facing unimaginable suffering
as their homes are destroyed and their loved ones are killed.
Millions of people are being forced to flee for their lives, carrying only their children, their pets, and the clothes on their back.
The pain, loss and destruction grows by the day.
The people of Ukraine urgently need our help.
Already a vast humanitarian operation is underway. Britain's Disasters Emergency Committee, or DEC, brings together 15 leading aid charities to respond to overseas disasters quickly and efficiently. These charities include the British Red Cross, CARE, Oxfam, Save the Children and World Vision.
Their teams are working on the ground in Ukraine and neighbouring countries to bring vital aid to those who need it most. If you can spare it, your gift to the DEC's Humanitarian Appeal will go a really long way.
£10 provides essential hygiene supplies for a person for a month.
£50 provides blankets for 4 families.
£100 provides emergency food for 2 families per month.
It's easy to give. You can donate online at dec.org.uk or call the 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. If you prefer to send a cheque, please post it to the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal, PO Box 999, London, EC 3A 3AA. To give £10 on your mobile, simply text the word crisis to 70150. Standard network charges apply for calls and you must be 16 or over. Texts are charged at the standard network rate and your £10 donation will be added to your bill.
100% of your donation goes directly to the DEC to save lives and deliver critical support where it's needed.
Easter holiday getaway, crikey, it's not gone well for many. More than 100 flights were cancelled across the UK today. Huge queues, again, forming at Birmingham, Manchester, Stansted airports, delays continuing to derail those Easter school holiday getaways. Disruption being blamed mostly on staff shortages and a sudden surge in passenger numbers, both caused by COVID or less COVID, if you see what I mean, and the curbs which have been in place for most of the past 2 years. Well, let's turn to the travel expert, Simon Calder, who I'm delighted to say has travelled here to the studio. Thanks for that. How bad has it been today?
Today has been probably the least bad this week. What we've got is 58 cancellations on EasyJet to and from UK airports, predominantly at Gatwick Airport, its main base. And then we've had 54 cancellations on British Airways, but 50 of those people knew about a kind of week or two ago, so they've had plenty of time with that. There was just last-minute cancellations, in particular one to Dublin, where they cancelled the morning flight and then put on a wide-bodied Boeing 787 for the early afternoon one to get everybody there. So if you happen to be booked in business, you got a lie-flat bed for half an hour while you were flying over the Irish Sea. So don't knock it.
And in terms of the provision that's coming from the airports and obviously the airlines, this is just presumably what, a hangover from COVID when they got used to skeletal minimal staffing? Is that what's going on?
That's a really good question. And I'm now actually just going through tomorrow's cancellations, and it's going to be worse tomorrow than it was today, by the way. We're already up to 50 EasyJet cancellations, and British Airways well into the dozens. And I'm looking at all the cancellations from all the UK airports on all the airlines, and if it really was just COVID and high rates of staff sickness, as British Airways and EasyJet say, then I would expect Ryanair and Wizz Air and Jet2 to be cancelling flights, and they're not. So a cynical person, I don't know if you ever get any of those on GBNews, but a cynical person would suggest that perhaps this is just under-resourcing and they've over-promised. I mean, basically, they've lost billions during the pandemic. They want to get that back. They see lots of demand. They put on loads of flights and then they think, right, where's the staff?
And there's presumably a little bit of hesitancy as well because, we've seen green shoots before. Yeah. Let's all pile back on the planes and then crunch the new variant.
Oh, sure,
So you can see why there's some reluctance to really go hell for leather.
Yeah, I mean, let's just go back to the start of December, and this is really kind of feeding into the airport side of things. Back in December, which was the sort of time where if you were thinking, OK, we're going to have an Easter blossoming of travel, you'd start recruiting people, getting them trained, security cleared and so on. But at the start of December, the UK suddenly came up with by far the most onerous, expensive, complex travel restrictions of anywhere in Europe. And so you're kind of thinking, well, do we having lost billions of pounds, do we now start hiring people, or do we just sort of see how it goes? And there's been a bit of caution, which I think is unfortunate, but not necessarily unexpected.
And someone who's missing from the staff roster here, because I mean, as you say, you've got to security check people and all the rest of it. You can't. How flexible is this labour market? Is it cabin crew? Is it pilots? Is it baggage handlers? Who is it?
Right. OK. So if you're looking at, for example, the British Airways operation at Heathrow, it's pretty much everybody. They lost about 10,000 really good, professional, experienced staff over the coronavirus pandemic. Yeah, and that's not unreasonable given, it's about 27%, I think, of their workforce. Given that the aviation industry collapsed at one point to 5% of what it would have been a year or two earlier, it's not unreasonable to be losing staff. Lots of people were on furlough. That ended. They would have looked around for other jobs which didn't involve getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and being yelled at by stressed travellers. And who can blame them? And now it's simply a matter of getting good people, training them up, but mostly throwing lots of money at them, which of course feeds through ultimately to higher costs for us.
And, I mean, there must be within the travel sector this just mass exhalation because, I mean, British Airways, I think, to be applauded for saying, for instance, OK, we are living with COVID, off with the masks, which has a psychological, that's a strong message, isn't it? Normality's back on your travels.
Yes, and that's actually part of the problem, Colin, because what you've got is people thinking, and some of the airports are sort of saying to me, actually, we've got the wrong kind of passengers. We got people who haven't been on planes for a couple of years, and they've completely forgotten the 100 millilitre liquids rule, so that's gumming things up. And I used to work in security at Gatwick, and as soon as you get a bag that you have to hand search, then everything slows down. So we're not helping there. Also, loads of people took it on face value when Grant Shapps, the Transport Minister, said, a month or so ago, great, we can all travel like we used to. The UK got rid of all its rules, but most countries in the world have still got them. So you get people turning up at Manchester, Gatwick, Heathrow, and they don't realise they've got to fill in forms, they've got to produce evidence of vaccination. That gums everything up as well.
Emma Webb, just back from Ireland, you didn't have a flatbed for the half an hour.
I went on a ferry.
Which is that's another story. We haven't got time for it. Storm Calder. Lovely of you to come in. Thanks very much indeed. Now, the most far-reaching change to divorce laws in half a century has been introduced, with so-called no-fault divorces ending the requirement to apportion blame. From today, it will not be possible to contest a divorce except in exceptional circumstances. Instead, couples in England and Wales will be required to provide a statement of irretrievable breakdown and go through a 20-week period of, the word that's used is reflection, before starting proceedings. Until now, unless someone could prove there was adultery, unreasonable behaviour or desertion, the only way to obtain a divorce without spousal agreement was to live apart for 5 years. Some experts fear that the new laws will result in a rush of new applications from couples. Meanwhile, other critics of the changes say they further undermine and devalue the sanctity of a once sacred institution, an institution which requires participants to make a vow of lifelong fidelity. That used to be the way kind of it was meant to work, wasn't it? Holly Bell is a former Great British Bake Off finalist who was inundated with requests for advice when she spoke publicly about her divorce. She ended up writing a book about that experience. Holly, thanks for your time today. What difference will today make? How different will things be from now on?
I think it's the first step in changing the way that divorce is processed in the UK. I know in Scotland they've already taken this step. I think it was in 2006. I don't think it goes far enough. It's what we're dealing with really is semantics. People know that when a couple go to get divorced, of course, you shouldn't be able to keep one person in a marriage if they don't want to be in it. I think what needs to happen next is to look at how the financial resolution is handled, because it's still being done and using 50-year-old laws. And obviously, we've all changed. The world has changed, and the way that men and women, and women and women, men and men, the way that we all live our lives, who does the childcare, who does more work than the other person. Lots of people are getting married later, so they're bringing considerable assets into the marriage. And at the moment, the starting point for splitting assets is 50-50. So I think it's great. Don't want to be negative, but I'm just going to bring I think it needs more.
Yeah. I'm just my studio friend today is Emma Webb. Who, Emma, you're not married, are you?
No.
No. Who's got a question for you, or at least an observation, Emma?
So I think, to be devil's advocate, I can understand, having read people's accounts of why they think that this is a good move by the government, that it makes it easier for people who, as you say, are trapped in marriages to more easily divorce. And I can understand the argument that that there is a concern that actually a separation that could be amicable gets poisoned by the need to lay fault at someone's door. I understand that. But I think, to play devil's advocate, there will be many people who would say that actually marriage is supposed to be a sacred institution, and that when you make a sacred vow that is supposed to be for life, that it isn't something that should be easy to get out of, and that actually it isn't too onerous to have to live separated for 5 years before getting that divorce. And I think that that the idea that marriage is an important institution within society is something that isn't necessarily having as much of a voice within this debate. And I'm interested to know what you think of those arguments.
I think if you speak to anyone who's been divorced, they would tell you that you don't come to a point of deciding to get divorced lightly. I certainly, on the day I got married, absolutely believed that I was getting married for life. There was no question in my mind. And I remember some people asking me, are you sure? And asking me lots of questions about how I felt about it. And I was sort of slightly disgusted that people thought it might end, because, you go into it with the greatest of intention. Is it too easy now to get out of? I don't think so. I mean, you've got to take your 20 weeks to reflect. Living apart for 5 years because one person in a marriage wants to stay married, I mean, it's probably better to ask someone who wants to, say, have children, and their fertility years that are being wasted because somebody can't cope with the fact they're being rejected. I personally don't feel it has any impact on the sanctity of marriage. I think that it's actually being respectful of human rights. You shouldn't have to be married to somebody if you don't want to be.
And Holly, just on the 20-week period of reflection, I mean, I just wonder realistically in how many failing marriages that period of reflection will make any difference at all. I read recently that, marriage guidance counselling is a lovely idea, but it's broadly ineffectual.
Yeah, I mean, my personal experience of speaking to lots of women for when I wrote the book, and also friends, is that by the time you're getting to a point where you are seeking counselling over your marriage, a lot of people are doing it in order to make their peace with the fact that it's coming to an end, or to gain some guidance on how best to do it. It's difficult. I think what we should be putting the onus on is doing pre-marriage counselling, which I know for a lot of religious couples already exists within the church. But for anyone who doesn't have a faith, it's not something that I've heard people are seeking out. Marriage is it's a contract. It's a legally binding contract. And I didn't really understand that when I got married. I got married because I was in love and because I wanted to make a life with someone. I wasn't really aware of the legal implications if that marriage came to an end. And I think
just a quick, we're almost out of time. Just a really quick one, and again in the spirit of sort of devil's advocacy. What about those situations where, one party to the marriage feels they've behaved with total probity, they've honoured those sacred vows that they've taken, and they feel actually traduced and let down, and maybe they can look at inwardly and think, well, I've made a misjudgment about this person. I thought they were going to be my lifelong partner. I got it wrong. They're unreliable. They've been with somebody else, whatever. But there has to be, even if it's just somebody they walk away with, a sense in which one party didn't enter into the spirit of that relationship as they ought to have done.
I had a woman contact me literally last week saying she thought that this was a dreadful idea because what she wanted and what she really held dear to her as part of her divorce was being able to say that her husband had been unfaithful. And that was really important as her reason. What I would say, having been through it, I think if you're still needing to win, for want of a better word, you probably need to talk to somebody about your feelings about the marriage, because you might not be ready to go through the court process. When you then go through to the financial side of divorce, it is not a court of morals. They literally do not care if someone has been unfaithful, if they've been abusive, if they've been abusive towards the children, if they've been financially controlling. I had one barrister actually say to me that unless you could prove your partner had done something worse than pistol whip you, then the court would not take any bad behaviour into account.
Holly Bell, we've got to leave it there, but absolutely fascinating, and thanks for entering into the spirit of that conversation. Thanks a lot. The word archetype means a typical example of a person or a thing. So something that is archetypal is typical. It's a word that's been used in English since the 1500s. It may come as a surprise, therefore, to learn that the Duchess of Sussex, an American who lives in California, a part of the world not known for its attachment to good grammar and syntax, has decided to patent the word so that others in certain circumstances can't use it. Meghan has apparently registered the word as the title of a new podcast and wants to stop anybody else from using the word archetypal, you might say. Joining me to reflect on that and the current state of the monarchy, Robert Hardman, whose new book, Queen of Our Times, offers a fascinating perspective on the future threats and opportunities faced by the royal family right now. And he joins us, as you see. Robert Hardman, welcome to you. Let's just start with Meghan, if we can. Patenting a word.
Well, hello, Colin. Good afternoon. It's. I think the Sussexes are certainly good value for money for their lawyers. It's another of many legal undertakings. Let's see where it goes. I know that these things for celebrities are increasingly keen to copyright, trademark every aspect of their lives. And this just seems an extension of what we've already seen. For example, the couple famously tried to trademark their website, sussexroyal.com, but that, of course, fell foul of British trademark law, so they had to stand back from that. I don't think any of us are going to stop using the word archetypal in future, regardless of the outcome of this particular application.
Just looking at your latest book, Robert, I've been reflecting on the Queen's long life and within that, the institution which she has honoured so much dutifully. And obviously only it's a fraction of her life now, in the last 2, 3, 4 years of the Sussex post, what some people feel is a real threat to the institution. Do you think that threat is overstated?
I think we're always prone to fixate on whatever the crisis of the moment is. If you look at any depiction of the Queen's reign, it's always rather seen through the narrative of crises. If you watch The Crown, it's this sort of rather grim existence as this put upon downtrodden monarch sort of lurches from one crisis to the next. And if you stand back, and that's why I wanted to write this biography, is stand back and look at the whole of her reign, not just her reign, but the whole of her life, and put it in context, you start to realise that, yes, the current crises, they're crises, but they're sort of second-order crises, really, when you look at some of the things she's been through. You go all the way back to the abdication. I was lucky enough to be given access to all her father's war diaries, all 11 volumes of them, locked away in the Round Tower at Windsor Castle. And when you actually see what the royal family really were going through in the war, as opposed to the sort of the official version, the sheer panic and terror the king felt after being dive-bombed in his own home, for example. The constant worries of doodlebugs. I mean, the week after D-Day, no one's talking about D-Day. They're talking about rocket bombs and writing letters to each other in case they get bumped off. I mean, when you've been through that, you take a new view on things like the Sussexes moving to California.
We've got 30 seconds left. I mean, you're talking about a real war. It feels to some people that the royals are now involved in the culture wars, whether they like it or not. Will they survive the culture wars?
They will, and they will subscribe to what they've always done, which is you follow the will of the people, the settled will of the people. Don't listen to Twitter. Don't get obsessed by social media. Be guided by what the majority want. And as a constitutional monarchy, you can't do anything except that.
Robert Hardman, as ever. Robert, thanks very much indeed. Thanks very much indeed for your time. Have a look at that Twitter poll. If you can vote. More than 2,000 of you have done. The word that seems to be coming up apropos Meghan is grasping. Jubes & Co is next.
Hello again, I'm Aidan McGivern from the Met Office. Some bright spells this afternoon, but a lot of cloud about, and showers will continue for many places, with the winds really picking up strength later as an area of low pressure starts to move in from the northwest, and the squeeze on the isobars just to the south of that low will bring gales to Northern Ireland, parts of western Scotland, northwest England and North Wales. So through the evening, the risk of wind gusts of 50, 60 miles an hour for Northern Ireland, parts of the Irish Sea coast, perhaps even 70 for North Wales and northwest England could bring disruption. Meanwhile, a spell of rain in the far south, mild here, but increasingly cold in the far north of Scotland, with the risk of significant snow of the hills of Caithness, Sutherland, the Grampians as well. I think 1 to 4 centimetres above 300 metres. That more persistent rain and hill snow moves south during Thursday morning, breaks up into showers, and during Thursday the winds moderate, but it stays windy, that wind coming from a cold direction, so it'll feel pretty raw in the wind. There'll be some bright weather in the far south, but elsewhere it's a mixture of sunny spells and also further showers. Rain and hail at lower levels, snow over the hills of North Wales, Northern England and Scotland. The showers tend to ease during Thursday evening, and with the winds falling a bit lighter, we're going to see widespread frost, particularly across central parts. So for southern Scotland, Northern Ireland, Northern England, North Wales, temperatures dipping below freezing away from main urban centres. But in the far south of England, here, cloudier skies and some outbreaks of mainly light rain just skirt along the south coast. The heavier rain mainly staying out in the Channel. Brighter skies elsewhere, plenty of sunshine around actually Friday morning for many, but further wintry showers will affect northern Scotland, and then